The character I'm going to read about is not the central character of this novel. Rather, it's her father, who is a retired New York City policeman who lives out in Jackson Heights, which is where she grew up. There are many strands of what my wife wants me to stop calling redemption in this novel. It, in a way, connects itself with redemption because everyone in it, to some degree, is attempting to make a place in which some redemptive ground can be covered. It takes place at a university, one of the universities that was thrust on North America on behalf of its native inhabitants. There really is no ground to be covered. There is other than the ground of guilt. A guilt that the people in it are constantly fighting to somehow cover, to somehow make good. And this is something they can never quite do. The student who is partly on a national merit scholarship, and partly there because of what she may or may not have been involved in, involving her father, who was one of the many cops who worked on what the New York cops called the Pile, which was the fall of the Twin Towers. There is this constant presence of guilt and also of the necessity of escaping from guilt. The motto of the school is partly the necessity of thrusting darkness, or thrusting light on top of darkness. Everywhere one looks around this university, as is often the case in universities, there is some kind of guilt, some kind of hope. There are halfway houses. There are places for people to go and get themselves straightened out. There are attempts on the part of people who went to the university 20 years before and never quite got out of it, whose parents rented them apartments somewhere in the area. The inhabitants of the halfway houses spend their time on street corners and on the street corner cafes, trying to find their way into light. There was a great preoccupation with darkness and light. There was also a great preoccupation with women in control of their bodies. I mean, the necessity of abortion, anti-abortion, the interference of the church, various kinds of churches in the abortion issue. The fact that this self-confident, rather over self-confident, more self-confident than he should be professor is having an affair with this particularly brilliant student whose father is a New York cop. The New York cop is obsessed with the fact that his wife has somewhat mysteriously died. There is or is not a murder involved in this process. Probably not, but possibly. The chief of police at the university was formerly a partner of this policeman. There is a constant attempt to escape what may or may not have been guilt that has been thrust onto these people. What happens in the beginning, in the section that I'm going to read, which is the 9th chapter, is the policeman finds that he has had a surprise visit from his daughter, who he has to some degree rejected because of her affair with this professor, which he's aware of. So it opens with his day. He lives near Lefferts Boulevard in Queens, a different Lefferts Boulevard than I lived on or lived near. Eddie Stack had developed an odd skill. He was able to comb his hair, what was left of it, without looking at his own face in the mirror. He kept his gaze above the hairline. Some foreign wit had observed that after 40 a man was responsible for his own face. Stack was over 40. In fact, he was past 65. And he desperately did not want any more responsibilities beyond those he bore. The face wanted some answering for. Young, he had never got enough of it. Don't think he hadn't looked in mirrors then. He had the deadpan, drunk, dumb, Mick face that could be transformed within a fractal to the deadliest of satirical grins, and the assumed angry face and the hassled face, the put-upon, the uncontrollable rage face that would break his partners up in the middle of a collar, the false smiles and the semi-genuine smiles, and the honest smiles that were not entirely unstudied. Not until he had gone into the job had he realized how attractive he was to women. Most women kind of loved all police officers, but Detective Stack was envied in his appeal. There was also, he vaguely knew, a mug of true rage. And that was the one he never looked at, and yet privately had worn sometimes. His entire life was private now, and he knew he must wear it very often. Look at the face on him, his mother used to say, fondly. But the face on him now, the one he might have to avoid in the mirror, The one he wore on the street was another matter. Richmond Hill was an immigrant neighborhood now. Most people there now simply did not resemble him. They were not fair nor tall. They were not bleeders, as white boxers had once been called in the fight game. When he wore his face on the street, a face now flayed by alcohol and high blood pressure and a volatile temperament, he could imagine he was being spotted as a boozy Irishman, a slave to drink and an aging ruffian. To what might be on Lefferts Boulevard a stare of curiosity at one of the aboriginal occupants of Queens by a recently arrived Bengali or Mauritanian or Parsi, and those he suspected as despisers of his kind. He showed the watery blue eyes, the rosy face. His strategy was to take his glasses off so that he would not see clearly the expressions of passers-by or of his own reflection in store windows. Beyond his own front hedges, which he paid a friendly Ecuadorian to trim, he truly did feel responsible for his face, almost, he thought, ashamed. What caused him to have his bushes trimmed by a hired hand was actually what drove him nearest to actual shame. He went on his errands step by step, and only after using or neglecting to use his three maintaining inhalers. He had emphysema that the doctors now called severe, so outstripped on the sidewalk by people 20 years older than himself, blocking the progress of young women on erring patient sighs behind him. He tried not to notice or even to see straight. He felt ashamed of himself. Early on, before the diagnosis, he had stopped cold climbing the second flight of stairs of the deep-down Jackson Heights subway station. About to pass him on the way down was a beautiful young woman, one to speculate about, a babe. Dry drowning as he was, she got his attention. "Oh, sir," she said. "Oh, sir, can I help you?" He wondered if he would ever be the same after that. Smoking had done it, as well as, and especially, his useless, as he saw it, presence at the Twin Towers. He never mentioned that. Not that there was anything to mention in it. Plenty of people he knew had been there. Some, quite a few, had died there. Then there were those who had been there a month and a half and talked of nothing else. There were those who had not been there and said they had. There were those who had, though there were those who knew the dark side of it. What Stack knew was the dark side of it, by which he did not mean the misled lads from afar with their faith-based initiatives, and the poor victims, God help them, but a different human dimension. Nothing was so bad it didn't have a dark side, Stack thought. On a warmish morning in December, he set out for the boulevard, a quarter-mile downhill. It was cloudy without the stimulation of winter. He did not need the paper to know it was a bad air day. His tactical plan was to walk the downhill stretch, past the tidy houses of his enterprising neighbors, and buy a Times. He had once been a follower of events, but it was pretty much the sports section now. Beside the Times, he would buy a Post because it was Friday and he wanted the Sunday line. Stack had been firmly ordered to walk on errands rather than drive. The principle of use it or lose it. He walked down the boulevard with his practiced obliviousness to what he had grown up calling the candy store, when Morris had sold egg creams and reportedly run a handbook. It was owned by a Pakistani now, an old man in a white cap that showed he had made the Hajj to Mecca. He had turned out to be a jolly old-timer, the old man. Cheerful, even jokey, though not as hilarious as Morris had been. a glum young relative of the old man's, was at the counter this day. Stack brought the papers and took the most level route home. The house was neatly kept, although his household needed replacing. The furniture was a museum of early 60s style. Stack did not shop for furniture or appliances. He had bought maritime prints at one point, and they were on his walls, along with a painting Maud had done as a teenager. The print and the painting cheered him somewhat. After his wife died and Maud passed her devout stage, he had removed the crucifix from the living room and carefully tucked it away behind Maud's tarot cards, which she had wrapped in silk. He took all the religious sacramentals down and put them in a closet, except for a reproduction of a Leonardo, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. That hung in the upstairs hall. He felt a little guilty about the stuff. It bothered him, religion aside. He would not put the objects in the garbage, which would be grossly disrespectful, and he did not want to outrage the sanitation guys. In the evening, he took his second walk of the day to an old Presbyterian church that now had a Korean congregation. The church basement was the location of his AA meeting. No Koreans attended. An Italian-American man in his mid-70s, slightly demented, maybe a little wet-brained, stood at the coffee pot near the door, welcoming everyone who passed through with a "thanks for coming." Afterwards, Stack would not remember a great deal about this particular meeting. The usual people were there. A couple of guys doing probation, half of them loaded, a few earnest Christians, an old Starker from the Furriers Union of long ago, black guys, white guys, the speaker, a man who had been off the sauce for a year. He looked young. He was slick. He was a musician. This was his share. As a boy, he told the meeting, he and his family had observed Passover with a Seder. In accordance with a tradition, a glass of wine was set aside for Elijah. This was not sweet Concord stuff, because my family did not go in for that kind of wine. This was Lafitte Rothschild. So my party trick as a child was I would sneak out, grab a man's coat and a hat I would find somewhere. Then I'd hobble in doing an old man shtick, the prophet himself, and I'd grab the wine and drink. This amused all my relatives. So, said the young man, I've been in eternal pursuit of my childhood faith. Stack laughed in sympathy, but a feeling of deep sadness overcame him. He did not stay for the serenity prayer. He had the loved daughter who was rash and rebellious. Whenever he needed or wanted his wife, she was dead. He had always had the strength, or at least the toughness, for that. A momentary lapse, he thought. That was the joke he made to other policemen when some impulsive perp had tried to pull off some mindless caper. The momentary lapse of a ne'er-do-well, he used to say, breaking everybody up. Thanks for coming, said the guy, as Stack went out. He took the easiest route home. Climbing the porch steps, like the steps to the upper room, exhausted him. He sat down in the nearest armchair to recover his breath. Immediately he knew that Maud was home. And the ways he knew propelled him back along their history in a manner that raised and battered his heart. There was the perfume, the marijuana, the booze smell that had not been loosed on the house since her last departure. And under these, in a weak moment, all the effluvia of her childhood, beloved and terrifying, of joy and rage. He stood up unsteadily, and having a practical side, reached in his pocket for the inhaler. The stairs were a hassle, but he lived from day to day. There in Maud's bed was the lovely mess of her. Hair over the pillow, and rain-wet clothes scattered around. The worst thing about her was the smell of tobacco, which he decided he would not abide. Not a word had come from her, but the Christmas holidays would soon be on them, something he paid little attention to. But of course she would be home for that. She looked comfortable enough, and would have been drinking whatever she'd bought. So he left her there. I'll stop.
That was, is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. It was fantastic to hear you read. It's a really powerful chapter, told from the perspective of Stack, who is Maud's father, and Maud is this young woman who goes off to college. And I think we can say, because it's been in every review, that she is the black-haired girl of the title who is killed. And so her death is a kind of vortex for me as a reader around which this book swirls. And quickly, I wanted to say, this is an absolutely amazing Robert Stone novel. And if people are here, I'm assuming you're fans of his work. I was so delighted to read this book, and I had heard that it was a thriller, and I was actually slightly worried that Robert Stone had written a thriller, because I don't normally read thrillers. I like Hitchcock, but when it comes to my literature, I need full complexity and pauses, and this book manages to be organized like a thriller. It is so precise and taut. It has an incredible architecture to it, but it's far too complexly full, to my mind, to really be thought of that way. Quickly, I also want to say it's his 8th novel, just minor discrepancy, not his 7th as it was introduced. And I feel like this distinction matters somehow, but maybe it's partly because I've been thinking of Robert Stone and Marcello Mastroianni in the Fellini movie 8½, when he plays the director who's made 8 fantastically received films, and he doesn't know what to do for his 9th. So he has a kind of surrealistic vision, and the movie is 8½. So I've been thinking of Robert Stone as being in that position now of 8½. But I wanted to ask about, there are many things to say. You just read a section that is my absolute favorite character in the book. He is really a heartbreaking character, and he's a retired New York City detective. And he thinks, to my mind, not that I know that much about cops, but he thinks like a cop, because we have his interior voice. And I wanted to ask Robert how he knows how police talk and how they think, and if this is just a great leap of creative ventriloquism, or if you've spent a bunch of time around them.
Well, I went to school with a lot of them. I went to school to a school that is now known as Archbishop Boy, which speaks for itself. It used to be called St. Anne's, but it's not the fancy St. Anne's in Brooklyn. It's out in Queens. I got thrown out of school in a kind of an interesting way that I was very, very happy with. I thought I was a Luther, and I thought I was giving.
Luther's pretty cool.
I was giving lectures to my fellow students, and I had a friend of mine who did eventually become a cop. He later became a Franciscan monk, and then I think he became a cop again. He was a mercurial figure. One day he refused to go to church, and his father beat him up, and his father said, "How come you're not going to church?" And so he confessed to his he confessed to his father. Well, this guy Stone, he says there isn't any God. So I don't know. I must have been more persuasive in those days than I am today, because I do find myself wandering in this odd dimension, in search of I have no idea what. But anyway, I got kicked out of school, and there was really very little else for me to do. So I joined the Navy. I was 17. I was the youngest guy to go through that smoke screen. That's my excuse for having emphysema today. Premature penetration of. I think the island we invaded was called Viegas. I think the Puerto Ricans who live on Viegas have thrown us out now, long overdue. I really had a good time. I have to confess. And
do you mean in the Navy?
Yeah. I mean, I was young. I was probably too young to be in it. But there I was. A lot of the kids I'd gone to school with were in the same outfit, in the same amphib outfit that I was in, and I think this diction. I mean, I think this police diction that I picked up. I probably picked up by honest means. But a lot of the people that I lived in, that I lived and worked with, had been in some kind of military formation. So that's kind of how I picked it up.
It's remarkable. Can you talk about the original spark, the idea to write the book? I don't know how important it is, but I had read that there was a murder at Yale of a young girl. I hadn't known anything about that until I looked it up online, and then I didn't want to go too far into researching that because I thought maybe it was just I didn't know how invested you were in this actual incident that happened. I know that the real girl was involved, or there was speculation that she'd been involved with a professor, and there's a professor in the book, Professor Brooksman, who is Maud's advisor and teacher, and he is also having an affair with her. But I don't know, what was the original spark for you?
There were a number. One was her involvement with the man I call Brooksman. I should not hesitate to say that Brooksman is a kind of educated thug who spent his earlier years working crabbing in Alaska. He got himself, as a result of federal fishery laws, into prison for a period of time. So he's a romantic figure in and around this campus. And Maud, the policeman's daughter, is very pleased with having her relationship with him. Her murder, if that's what it is referred to by a local psychiatrist, a psychiatrist who is in this sort of lost place, who lost his job for making off with one of his students to India. Some of you will be old enough to remember Baba Ramdas. he made off, the psychiatrist made off with one of his students to Baba Ramdas, as a result of which he was fired. There's one continuous statement that the psychiatrist is fond of making. The psychiatrist has found himself demoted now to a state job, deciding who among students or citizens of the state are deserving of disability pensions. That's essentially his job. He has a little office next to the railroad tracks where the Boston and Maine Railroad goes by, and more or less on an intuitive basis, he decides who among the possible passengers or crewmen of the train deserves disability compensation. He also has a way of saying people want their suffering to mean something. He has a friend on campus who was her husband was a British official, a prominent Catholic British official, who was present for a rogue IRA operation in several years ago. And in the course of this operation, her husband, who is on scene because he's a prominent British Catholic, and her son, who is 11 years old. Her husband is killed, her son is blinded, encountered them on a train on the way to Barcelona, because the train would stop in Perpignan and it would stop near Lourdes. So these people are getting off the train near Perpignan in hopes that some kind of Catholic miracle will intercede and restore the boy's lost vision and perhaps her husband's lost life. I know this is a very difficult book to explicate or explain, and I apologize for its scattered nature. I can only hope to promise you a consistency and a degree of hope which is contrary to just about everything else in the book, which concerns itself largely with despair. But I don't think I've written a book at this point that has not, in some degree, just in some measure, presented itself with a degree of hope, which is present here. So in a way, this is very largely about hope and about a vision, a sidereal, or rather a sidewise vision of hope that all the people in it are somehow concerned with. There's also an intense degree of guilt. Guilt, hope, despair. I mean, the usual things that we all live with are the things that this particular book is about.
uh, the principal utterance, I think, is made by the psychiatrist, who's Victor Lerner, who involved himself in radical causes in Latin America, as did another one of my characters, a friend of his. The insistence that people require their suffering to mean something. You cannot endure suffering without imposing on it some measure of meaning. And I think we pursue these themes throughout the book. And I think, I hope, that Rachel will have seen these things where they manifest themselves. I know she will, because I'm a reader of hers. And she is going to see things within this dimension, within this smokescreen that keeps haunting me, that I myself have perhaps more difficulty in perceiving than she will have, or than I hope that many of you will have.
You mean in the book?
In the book.
Yeah.
And not only in the book.
There's so much in this book. The way that it opens, he starts with a description of the college and Maud's experience of the university, and it's a very powerful evocation of the conflict and tension between the school and the surrounding. It's a failing mill town where the school is located. It's, fictitious school, but it could be something like Amherst or something like Yale. I don't have a lot of experience with fancy schools like that. I went to UC Berkeley, but I have a lot of experience with a school that was surrounded by a very dark place in a way. And there is a sense in which an initiation, as I'm sure you all know, into college is an invitation to test the boundaries between the school and that kind of darkness. And in his description, it's immediately you hear about the homeless people across the street wearing dumpster ski jackets with plastic leaking out of them. It's a great description, and it's also just an understanding of both sides of this. It is not told from the perspective really of a privileged college student. It shows both sides, and it suggests that there is some equation between welfare hotels and beautiful young women who have everything in their lives going for them. And he also describes the mentally ill who sort of wander the campus, which was strangely a big part of my own experience of college. There were people you didn't want to ride in the elevator with, just because you didn't know what was going to happen, but the campus was theirs as much as it was ours. And on the other side of that, the book opens kind of with the potential threat of mental illness for the students who are enrolling in school, because when that clock is going to go off, that alarm, it goes off when people are 20 or 21. It happens in college. And one of the characters, a wonderful character named Joe Carr, who's kind of, in a way, I think, a resurfacing of a character from Flag for Sunrise, counsels all the students and has to deal with what happens to them and send notes to their family, etc. So it was an interesting version in a way of, it's very classic Robert Stone territory to have someone lose their mind. But in this case, there's such a timed logic to it because it happens for people in college. I wanted to ask you about the Professor Brooksman, as you called him, a kind of thug. I found him very likable despite that, though I don't think I don't think it's a responsible thing to do, to have an affair with your student, but it happens. And there's a great scene where he is stressed out, and in order to relax himself, he rereads the sports page and then watches Red River, and it's just a very I think my husband probably rereads the sports page when he's stressed out of a game that's already happened. But he has a line, an interior thought, that love has a morality all its own, and it's his rationale in a way for having gotten involved with his student, and it just made me think about morality. And I asked myself, in a way, am I reading a morality play? I think that you stay away completely from moralizing, but you suggest in a way that the characters have some relationship to morality, whether they feel themselves to be in the lines of their own morality or outside of them.
I think morality is, in a way, moralizing is the great enemy of morality. I mean, the moralizing process, the process of through which we conduct ourselves, in moral terms, consciously, is the greatest enemy of a truly moral condition, because you can't have a moral situation. You can't have a moral structure. You can't have fiction, you can't have poetry without some degree of moral structure. It's absolutely impossible. And this is to say the opposite of, the necessity for moral stance, moral necessity. I always remember two things that stay with me, and one is a book of Graham Greene's. It's one of his Men-at-Arms trilogy, and he plants a character who is seen to be a kind of salvific character who comes to the rescue of the character in every military unit or every grouping of people charged with responsibility, who are victimized by the people that they have to serve with. And he has the sense to realize that this character being hazed has got to be perceived as a victim, just as his cohorts have to characterize him as a victim. the way in which people assemble themselves in moral positions is really quite extraordinary. I remember another kid. I just started teaching, if teaching is the word for what I do, which it isn't, because you don't teach people to write. There was no body of technology to impart, but I remember this kid setting himself up in such a position that he became, in this situation, the redemptive character, and the figure in the novel who was really the opposite character, the victimized character, was so placed that his colleagues rejoiced in his humiliation. It was rather expertly done, and I remember marveling over it at the time. This character who had to be placed so that he was continually, regularly victimized and selected as the British used to call the guy. A situation one comes across really quite often, where the victimized character has got to be assisted, loved, generally hazed and time after time selected as the victimized character, done with great skill, because the author understood that if this character was not placed in a situation where he was victimized, the entire structure of the novel, of the story, would fall apart completely. He had to be placed where he was the victim. He had to be placed where he was assisted by someone who undertook his cause.
So what happened to this young writer?
Nothing good. Nothing good if I could help it. I mean, it was a truly loathsome kind of setup.
Yeah.
The cleverness with which he placed his victimized character as in a hopeless situation, in an unredeemable, hopeless situation. And I thought how remarkably clever to put this, to put this character where he can only be, where his only friend is his principal persecutor. And that's what I mean when I talk about the necessity of a moral situation. You cannot really have. I remember getting in a kind of pointless argument with William Gass once, where Gass entitled his piece, "Goodness Knows Nothing of Virtue." That can't be right, can it? I think I have a worse cold than I realize. No, his situation was constantly one in which there was this absolute separation between any kind of redemptive process and any kind of hope for the character who was about to undergo the process of suffering. It was kind of horrifying, because it was really all about a moral situation in which this one character was constantly subjected to persecution of all kind, and the necessity for his ongoing persecution and his ongoing protective status on the part of his protector it never stopped. It just never quit. And there was something absolutely virtuoso, like, in the perception of the victim's situation and his protector's situation.
You say virtuoso, I think, a little bit sarcastically.
I say it sarcastically. I have trouble not using it sarcastically.
He's rewarding himself as the sadist author.
Right. I'm thinking of Graham Greene, I think.
I
think a lot about Graham Greene. I have a thing about Graham Greene.
Well, his name comes up a lot or a fair amount in reviews of your work, and I'm always surprised to see it. Maybe I'm proprietary about your work because I'm a student of it and have read it for so many years, but I have never once thought of Graham Greene when I was reading you, although I happen to know that you both come out of a Catholic background and write about, far-flung places. But to me, that those are where the similarities end. There's something, I like Graham Greene, but there's something much more prim about his whole perception, I think, of reality, whereas you have the full picture with the full gritty, imperfect picture. And no one is even a pure victim in this book. Everyone seems to have some participation in this in a way, it's a fascinating death. The girl's death is in the middle of the book. it's slowed down to this kind of excruciating duration, and it's a very, very beautiful moment when she dies. And she, in a way, has brought it on herself by fighting with the anti-abortion fanatics who demonstrate in front of the clinic near her school. And there's a great quote from her father, Stack, whose portion you read, who warns her that religion for people is not opium. He says, it's their mother. You understand? I can't say that in a Queens retired police detective accent, but it's an amazing moment. And I don't know if we have time for it, but it was one last. I just wanted to ask you. It made me think of you because instead of a mother, you had a Catholic orphanage. So I don't know if I can ask you about that. If it would.
Oh, sure. No, I would, left to my own devices, I would go on and on. No one would remain.
But so you lived there till you were 9, right?
Hopelessly sorry for myself. But it's your mother, all right. It's, that rejected, the mother who's rejecting you while you're rejecting her goes on at the same time. It's a marvelous process. It's funny, I never ran into any of those awful things that people are supposed to run into in Catholic orphanages. I don't know whether I was faster on my feet or what gifts heaven allowed me. But it was an adventure. It was an adventure, all right. But that these escapes, near escapes, this dependence, this mutual dependence, and it's funny, there was a mutual dependence in process that we somehow escaped, or never quite escaped from. I mean, you don't stop. In a way, Catholicism is something that you don't ever quite shake off. And yet, I think the closest I ever came to understanding Catholicism was Gershon Schollem's book, The Magic Messiah, about Sabbatai Zvi. I don't think I ever came closer to understanding the nature of...
Sabbatai Zvi is a notorious heretic.
Right, a notorious heretic, a false messiah.
I know this because my husband's Gmail address is sabbatizwe@gmail.com.
No, I don't think I ever quite really came to understand what the left hand of God signified. What the Trinity, what the idea of a Trinity, of the Catholic Trinity signified, as clearly as I did reading Gershon Schollem's Life of Sabbatai Zvi. Sabbatai Zvi and his sidekick, Nathan of Gaza, tremendously important people to me. They figure very largely in my version of Catholicism, which is a little bit off. off the orthodox rail. But
sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
We're getting a little on time, so I just wanted to say if we have any audience questions for either Rachel or Robert, now we have time for maybe a couple.
I think I've probably so confused issues and robbed them that I've left no one with the opportunity to ask any rational questions. So far have I wandered from the rational. But please, I'm sorry. I'm
Actually,
kidding.
in the back, I think we've got one.
At the point you said that you don't think you can, there's no technology to impart upon writers. We can't teach writers. And I'm wondering if there's been an instance where you've tried and not been able to.
I think you can teach prosody. You know, if you're an instructor in poetry, you can impart prosody. You learn by reading. It's really the only way. I mean, to learn to write is by reading. I mean, if you don't read Rachel, you don't know what writing's for. I mean, it's one of the things that made one of the more recent reviews of one of her books so particularly infuriating, because the joy of it, the pure abundance of it, the satisfaction of it was all there, was all to be had. And I don't know, this particular reader seemed to take it as a particular point of resentment. No, you learn by reading. You can learn prosody, but you can't teach somebody how to write. I mean, you can say I after E except before E, or however it goes. But that's about as far as it goes, I think.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you both for coming out tonight. Thanks to all of you for coming and hearing Rachel and Robert speak. They're both going to be signing books over at this table afterward, and we have copies of both Death of the Blackhaired Girl and The Flamethrowers by the Registers.
And thank you all for coming out on this dreadful night for a treatment of my sort of mnemonic respiratory exercises here. But thanks again. In other words, thanks again for coming. Thank you very much.